the PowerPoint presentation on establishing the middle colonies. All right, so the middle colonies, besides being in the middle, there are some general characteristics about them. One, they were a mix of the two, New England and the South, in terms of you had some areas where they had larger plantations, but you didn't have tobacco being as widespread because their environment was not quite as warm in the South. It was a little bit mix of New England in terms of there was some small scale farming, there were religious elements, um, but really, if you kind of try to characterize the middle colonies, they're very diverse. They had a lot of different ethnic groups that were a part of them, and they had a tremendous amount of um, religious toleration for the most part. And so here we go. All right, New York. So New York, before it was called New York, was called New Netherlands, and that is because the Dutch were responsible for colonizing it. In the early 1600s, a man by the name of Henry Hudson, an Englishman, was being employed by the Dutch government, and he was to go and explore, and he ended up sailing up the river that now bears his name, the Hudson River. And at the mouth of the Hudson River, around the Delaware Bay, you see the first Dutch colony that gets built, and that would be on what we would call today Manhattan Island, and what they called at the time New Amsterdam. Now, New Amsterdam was established in 1624 as a headquarters for the fur trade, and that's really the primary interest in the Dutch East India Company, is that they wanted to get as much fur out of there, and it was really a business enterprise. They didn't really people it like the English end up doing. In fact, at certain points, there were just as many English as there were Dutch. New York, out of all of the colonies, New York was probably the most diverse. They had, Finns, Swedes, Dutch, English, Africans, Jews, so all sorts of people that came to live in New Amsterdam and to make money off the fur trade. Now, they tried to people it, and so they established what amounts to a large plantation called a patroon. And really, it's just kind of a big feudal manor in which you had a patroon who was like a noble, and they would give the tenants tools and allow them to use his mill and everything that a feudal manor would provide. But unfortunately, there just weren't enough people that wanted to come over and work on these patroons, and so it didn't go particularly well. As I said, New York became a colony of great ethnic and religious diversity. When the English come in and take over from the Dutch, there's the famous articles of capitulation that establishes individual freedoms for people in New York, or what will become New York, and that kind of stuck with New York, the rights and individual freedoms. We need to point out that this area, New Netherland, or as it becomes New York, is bordered by a very powerful Native American group called the Iroquois. And the Iroquois were probably about 15,000 strong. They were a really powerful group compared to what most English ran into in terms of Native Americans. And so, they kind of extended from the Great Lakes all the way up to where they were in Manhattan Island, and they would be, they were a very dominant force that the Dutch at first, and the English had to deal with. When Charles II comes in and he establishes the Restoration colonies, one of the first things that he wanted to do was to get rid of that area of Dutch control in the middle between New England and the Chesapeake. And so, in really a bloodless overthrow, they kick the Dutch out, and they take over New Amsterdam, they take over New Netherland, and they rename it New York. And once they do this, it's never been the same. The English are going to take over the fur trade in that area. And even though the Dutch kind of left their cultural imprint on different, names of streets, Wall Street and Broadway, things like that, after that, the Dutch influence in North America was on its way out. Okay, if you've ever been to New York, you know that very close across the bay or the river is New Jersey. New Jersey was initially bought by two proprietors and and was divided up between what they called West Jersey and East Jersey. And eventually, William Penn, the proprietor of Pennsylvania, ends up buying, East Jersey. And then eventually, in the early 1700s, New Jersey is united and just becomes one colony, a royal colony in 1702. Uh, Jersey is a fairly diverse place as well, but what it becomes most known for was that it becomes populated by a group of people called the Quakers. And we'll talk about the Quakers more when we talk about Pennsylvania. Okay, so Pennsylvania was set up by a man named William Penn. And William Penn's father actually was the first one to uh, get the huge tract of land in America from the king. Um, Initially, during the English Civil War, William Penn's father supported Parliament, and Parliament rewarded him by giving him this huge tract of land. So let me start a little bit about kind of William Penn's views in terms of setting up this colony. William Penn was a very wealthy gentleman, but he was also deeply religious, and he was part of the Society of Friends that history kind of knows as the Quakers. And the Quakers, they were extremely strict on themselves to the point where they kind of were seen as social outcasts in England. And so William Penn set up Pennsylvania and later New Jersey as a safe haven for Quakers. Now, Pennsylvania is blessed, much like the middle colonies are, with very fertile land. And so, upstate New York, Pennsylvania, parts of Delaware, they're very good areas for farming. And so, as the Quakers come over, they find that farming in this area is very easy. And furthermore, they find that the port of Philadelphia becomes extremely important in the commerce and trade of this new and vital English colony. Because the Quakers were very tolerant, they attracted a lot of different people that came into Pennsylvania, a lot of people that were dissenters in other colonies. They were really good in terms of relations with Native Americans, and they got along. And a lot of times, Native Americans lived in Quaker towns, so they, kind of like we talked about with Plymouth. The Quakers had a really good relationship with the Native Americans around them, which is not typically the norm for English settlements. Another thing to point out is that eventually Delaware, who was originally occupied by the Swedes, they had a short-lived colony in what we would call Delaware, and then eventually Delaware gets absorbed by Pennsylvania. In effect, the Pennsylvania governor served as Delaware's governor, even though they elected their own assembly officials to make laws. Now, the Quakers, they were an interesting group of people, but I think if they were around today, they would have been tolerated a lot more. They had a lot of ideas that, kind of make a lot of sense. They were against tax-supported churches. In other words, if you didn't go to the Quaker church, you did not have to pay your tithe. They were all about freedom of worship. They were, they refused to show deference to people. In other words, there weren't superiors and inferiors. Everybody was seen as equals, even women. The picture up above you can see is supposed to be of a woman who is, preaching in a church. So women had equal importance. There was no predestination or original sin. And then the Quakers, they were pacifists. They refused to fight. They were very like extraordinarily peaceful. They wouldn't swear allegiance to any government, and that kind of put them at odds a little bit with the English government. But they were a very tolerant group of people, and like I said, that attracted many different people from around and caused them to be a very diverse colony in Pennsylvania. Okay, the last one, Delaware. We talked about Delaware in terms of eventually they're taken over basically by Philadelphia, Philadelphia's government in Pennsylvania, and then Pennsylvania's governor, oversees them. But originally, Delaware was founded by the Swedes. The Swedes brought with them their ideas of making log cabins and things like that. But eventually, it gets taken over by the English during the Restoration, and as I said, administered by Pennsylvania. Okay, this ends the short, hopefully, lecture on the Middle Colonies. Please make sure that you do your reading that was assigned to kind of re-go over the details. Thanks for joining in.